This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider interview, my guest is Brian T. Carroll. He's running on the American Solidarity Party ticket for president in 2020, and I will converse with him about his life, his beliefs, the American Solidarity Party, and so forth. And the conversation will begin when we return. This is the second of my interviews with minor party or third party candidates for the American presidency in the year 2020. Brian T. Carroll is my guest, and I want to start off by asking a little bit about himself, then his party and his beliefs. Brian, welcome, and if you could give a little background about who you are and why you're running for president.
Thank you, Dan. Well, I grew up in LA, San Fernando Valley. Was born in December '49, so just barely into the first half of the century, and very much influenced by all the boomer things, the Vietnam War and the Cuban Missile Crisis. In fact, we didn't know it at the time, but the film that was given to Kennedy, my dad was one of two people in the United States developing that film at the time, and he never learned whether he was his shift or the other shift. But it was good. Ideal childhood. I lived surrounded mostly by my mother's extended family, and we were middle class, public schools, and my dad was, although he never finished college, was very good at introducing me to a lot of stuff. He'd read us a book at night, and even though I was the oldest of five, and we were pretty young, he'd read us things like Call of the Wild or O. Henry. He really liked Ogden Nash. And so a lot of the wordplay kind of stuff and good literature from the beginning. My mom was choir director at the church, and so I sang in the choir from a very young age, learned the harmonies for all the great hymns, and enjoyed singing.
If you don't mind, what denomination were you?
Methodist.
Methodist, okay.
I grew up Methodist. I'll come back to that a little bit later because that's important, but it comes later in the story.
Okay.
And in public school, in junior high, I became very close friends with Steve Erickson. Does that name ring a bell?
No.
He's written, I don't know, 18 or 20 novels.
Okay.
And he's done a lot of film criticism. I think he's a member of the American Academy. And he does music criticism and novels. And I probably learned more from him than any of my teachers. All the great music of the late 1960s and early 70s I heard first at his house, and we would critique them, and we would critique each other's writing, and so we were really close during the junior high school, and then I went off to community college, and he went off to UCLA. Eventually I joined him down there, and we continued to take some creative writing together. After UCLA, went off to Europe for 3 months of hitchhiking around, and I went over there thinking I'd stay in one place and try and finally learn the French that I had taken so much of in school. And instead I got over there and said, you know what, I just want to see all of it. And so I wound up getting through the British Isles and Central Europe down into Yugoslavia and Turkey, and flew to Israel. Came back and got married and started a family. And at that point, I realized that I was not going to be making enough money as a writer to do that as a living. But I had taken a history major, and teaching was always a possibility. And so I started teaching school, Central Valley, the little town where John Steinbeck came to do his research for Grapes of Wrath. And That was an interesting experience. The community was changing. About half of my students were the children or grandchildren of that earlier migration, and the other half had come up from Mexico. In fact, 10 years before I started teaching there, when Cesar Chavez made his march from Delano to Sacramento, they spent one night sleeping on the lawn at my elementary school. And so that was interesting. By that time, I had learned enough Spanish. My wife's family spoke Spanish. That with 2 years of college Spanish, I had more Spanish than any other teacher on the faculty. And so I got called to be the translator at parent conferences and things. During that period, I got very interested in starting some public transportation in my town, and got involved in organizing. And I was asked to write a monthly column for a kind of newspaper you get at the counter at the supermarket, freebie. But I used that platform to write primarily about public transportation, and we were successful in getting a system started. And that has gone on today to be a real valuable asset to our community. And then I got interested in Bible translation. And so I joined Wycliffe Bible Translators, and they sent me to Columbia. And I taught school there to the children of the missionaries. And that was as prime a teaching assignment as you could ever find. Small classes, good kids, no disciplinary problems at all. Very, very intellectually stimulating. I developed friendships with speakers of a dozen or 14 of the indigenous languages. We'd play soccer together. There were some people from jungle groups and mountain groups, and it was very, very interesting stuff. My hobby is spiders, and there were spiders all over the place. Many of them had never been named by science, so we found some and got some of them named. There was, botanical stuff everywhere. A ornithologist visited and said that my covered porch was the finest bird blind in the Western Hemisphere. And so then I said, well, I guess I have to look at birds too. And there was just something everywhere. So both intellectually and I liked the climate. We were on the edge of a lake. I could swim before work every morning, go out and swim in the lake, and then get to work on time. And after work, swim again, or go play basketball, or go play soccer with the indigenous fellows. It was just wonderful. There was, of course, a civil war going on down there, and eventually the school was evacuated. The father of one of my students was kidnapped by the FARC, and he was in captivity for over 2 years. He was still in captivity when we finally left. Came back to the United States, and it was a difficult period. Trying to find my niche after that was difficult. And so I think everybody in the family was kind of mourning the loss of paradise, and doing it each in our own way. And so it was rough years for my marriage, and it was rough years all the way around. I taught 6 years at third and fourth grade. I was hired there to teach a transition program, so that speakers who had been in a Spanish language program would be in my class to transition into English language. I did that for a year, and then California outlawed bilingual education. And so I bounced around and tried some different things and never got comfortable. never felt that I was where I should be. But again, those were intellectually challenging years. I got interested in prison reform. My kids, a high percentage of the kids in that community would go on to prison, and I was trying to figure out what I could do to help keep them from getting to prison. And I got involved in the lives of a couple of those boys, especially, and that was pretty intense. I started pen pal with a fellow on death row in San Quentin, and eventually went in twice to be locked into a cell with him and just talk. And we had a good relationship. I learned a lot. But my career, my teaching was getting worse and worse. I was feeling less and less effective. So I took a year off, did some healing and did some writing. Went back again for a year at junior high, and it was as bad or worse than it had been. So I just go ahead and resigned that position. And started a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing at Cal State, Fresno. And then I took a summer and taught English in China at a university, and came back saying, you know what, I am a teacher. You know, I can do this. And then I taught 2 years at a Christian school, got back into the routine, started believing in myself again, and took one more year off trying to finish the novel that was my master's thesis. I finally turned it in as 2/3 of a novel. And then the fellow who had taken my job when I left from my first job, Farmersville, he retired, so I went back into my first job and taught my last 11 years back there. I had been gone 25 years, which meant that the students I had, some of them were the children or grandchildren of the first students I had. So I was able to see that community change and those families change. That was really a neat experience. And I retired last June. Well, have to back up. In 2016, I gave up on the two-party system and said there has to be something better, and found the American Solidarity Party and got involved in bringing it to California. And then once we were set as a party, we said, all right, you have to, if you're a party, you have to run candidates. You know, I said, okay, what am I going to run for? And I very quickly set my sights on Devin Nunes, who was my congressman, and he seemed like a worthy target. And I was still teaching, so I didn't have a lot of time. I didn't have any money, didn't have any committee locally. And but I enjoyed the little bit of campaigning I was able to do. I didn't publish any literature, was in some candidate forums and marched in a few parades, and it was a good experience. And when it was over, I had, in a field of 6, I finished 5th. I beat the Libertarian. And but it was a good experience, and I realized that by the time I had done it, I had made myself a prominent candidate to be the American Solidarity Party nominee for president in 2020. And I had really about 2 years time to get used to that idea. And I had some reservations at the beginning, but one at a time, the reservations kind of fell away. And so I retired in June, primarily because I knew I was going to be running for president this year. Good thing. I'm glad I'm not teaching in the middle of the lockdown with all the schools closed and everybody trying
Yeah.
to teach by uh, video, and that would have been really hard.
Yeah.
So I'm married. I have 5 adult kids and 14 grandkids. They're spread all over the world, and that's who I am.
Well, thank you. Before we get into your views and the ASP's views, just a couple of questions or observations based upon what you said about yourself.
Mhm.
So it seems like you have an interest in naturalism and writing. Have you ever heard of Lauren Isley?
Say it again.
Lauren Isley. Have you ever heard? He was a famed naturalist and a great writer. I'm just wondering if you'd ever heard of Lauren Isley.
Right.
Okay.
Um,
Uh, and you also have a history, an interest in history, as you stated. Just since you were born in the middle of the 20th century, what do you think about the presidents of your lifetime? Do you think that they could have been better had they been more aware of the historical precedents and the historical trends? Do you think that a lot of modern American presidents are just ahistorical and just really not versed in human nature and history?
I think all of them, some more than others, but all of them have had some awareness of history. Uh, I remember when JFK was president, I read his Profiles in Courage, which is history. I read a lot of history when I was in elementary and junior high. I read lots and lots and lots of biographies. Um, I think they all, to a certain extent, have their hands tied. We have progressively over the time, over my lifetime, uh, industry has taken a bigger and bigger role in controlling things. You know, Eisenhower warned us of the military-industrial complex, and we absolutely see that. And so, even somebody who has, campaigned on uh, more ecological kinds of things, like Obama, could only go so far. They simply were not able to break through from the donor cycle and all of that and do the kinds of things they might have liked to have done if they weren't captured that way.
Mhm. So let's talk about some of your views specific to you and the ASP. In looking them up, they started out being called the Christian Democratic Party of the USA. What are Christian Democrats worldwide and also in the US?
Well, the Christian democratic tradition started in Europe uh, about the turn of the late 19th, early 20th century. There was a prime minister in Holland, Abraham Kuyper, who was important in that. It was at a time when there was a push and pull between communism and fascism, and they were offering an alternative. Much of it came out of the uh, social and economic writings of several of the popes. It got another boost after World War II. Konrad Adenauer in Germany. In England, G.K. Chesterton and Hilary Bullock were both writing things that heavily influenced the Christian democratic tradition. Today, Angela Merkel is in that tradition. And when our party started in 2011, we started with the name Christian Democratic Party of America. But half the population was turned off by the term democratic, and the other half of the population was turned off by the name Christian, because they both have different implications than they had at the founding in Europe. And so we and I wasn't a member of the party yet, but the party poked around and said, well, okay, what else can we call ourselves? And Solidarity Party invokes the idea of Lech Walesa and his Solidarity Party in Poland. And we are a party that supports unions. Of course, Lech Walesa was in close alliance with Pope John Paul II. And our party has a lot of Catholic roots. I'm an evangelical, but the party is heavily indebted to the writings of several of the popes. And so solidarity today, even, you say you're solidarity and somebody says, well, that's communist. Well, yeah, but the Solidarity Party is what helped bring down communism. And so it's hard to find labels, to find words that don't have so many conflicting implications. It's really hard to find a name that's you're starting for scratch.
Yeah, it's interesting because in looking over some of the ideals of the ASP, which we'll get into in a little bit, it's sort of an interesting blend of what here in the U.S. some would consider right-wing positions, like being pro-life, against abortion. As you mentioned, some would consider left-wing positions being pro-union. It reminds me a lot of, and my wife is a big fan of Thomas Merton. Have you ever read any of Merton's writings?
I have not read Merton. I have a lot of friends who think very highly of Merton, and someday I hope to have time to read him.
Yeah. Okay. So, Christian Democrat. Here in the U.S., we have the separation of church and state. When you call yourselves a Christian Democrat, or now the ASP, you're not looking to establish religion in public life, are you?
No. In fact, I don't think it's healthy for either government or the church, religion, for them to be too closely tied. Mm-hmm. We bring in Christian ideals, but we're certainly not looking to establish any particular religion. We have within our organization, within our party, we have members who are Jewish, we have members who are Muslim, we have the full range, Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, and all the different flavors of Pentecostals and mainline. And so we're not looking to establish a church in any way, but we do respect the freedom of religion that we have in this country. And we are concerned that it's being chipped away at. We think that the way to protect religious freedom is to protect the freedom of all religions. So we're not trying to establish any one of them in any way as superior to the others.
Brian, I wanted to pick up on a larger view of society before we dig into some of the specific issues. And you'd mentioned G.K. Chesterton, and on the website and also in reading up on you, it seems that you and the ASP support what is called distributism, which is sort of a midway point between capitalism as we know it and socialism as we know it. What exactly is distributism, and why do you think it's a good thing?
Well, I'm going to disagree with you that it's close to socialism.
Well, I said it's about midway between.
Well, yeah. If you have just a binary, this and this, then yeah, maybe you can put it in the middle. But see, that's another one where the term is, people assume because we have a binary, we don't anywhere in the world have either pure capitalism or pure socialism. But if the capitalists hear you say that you are a distributist, they say, okay, well, that's socialist. And if the socialists hear you say that you're a distributist, they say, oh, that's capitalism. We are off the binary. We definitely believe in private property. And we believe in entrepreneurial freedom. What we don't believe is where our current system is stacked in favor of a few people amassing unfair amounts of private property to the detriment of everybody else. 40% of Americans have negative net worth. And that's not because they're not out there working hard. You know, those 40% are not sloughing off, laying on the couch watching TV. Many of those people are working 3 part-time jobs because they can't find 1 full-time job. They don't have health insurance because nobody will give them more than 28 hours a week. They're working like crazy and falling farther and farther behind. And of course, the virus now has exposed that.
Yeah.
We are the only industrial country that does not have health insurance for everybody. And right now, when we suddenly need health insurance for everybody, massive numbers of workers are losing their jobs.
Yeah.
And that's because a small number of businesses have been able to shift a lot of the responsibility to their workers over onto the government. You know, if you are not working full-time anywhere, your 3 part-time jobs might be 60 hours a week, but you don't have health care anywhere. And so you wind up going to the county hospital and running up enormous bills on the taxpayer. Well, why not shift so that the taxpayer is paying for insurance for everybody to start with? And then businesses are free to hire who they want, as many hours as they want. People are free to look for a better job without fear of losing their health insurance. We have a system where we think it's cheaper to manufacture something in central China, truck it to the coast, put it on a boat, bring it over here, send it to a warehouse in Benton, Arkansas, and then send it out over the public highway system in heavy trucks that are hard on the roads and don't pay their fair share to maintain the roads. And they go into a community and go into a big box store that puts the little guys out of business. We don't want to see that. We want to see a system that supports local businesses, businesses that are hiring local people for good jobs. We want to see opportunities for young people that have the energy to get in and start a business. How do you start a business today in competition with some of the big box guys? And you'll notice that we have a shutdown, and it's not the big boxes that are being closed. It's the little guys that are being told they cannot open their businesses. We want to tip the scales in the other direction so that the little guy, the entrepreneur on a local level, has an even, or maybe even better than even, playing field. That's not socialism. We do want to see co-ops. There's a fellow up in Oregon who just turned his business was milling flour, and he was very successful at it. And now he has retired, and he has turned his business over to his workers as a co-op. We can adjust the tax laws to encourage that. There's lots of things we can do to distribute ownership, encourage ownership to a broader slice of the economy, the people in the economy.
So I wanted to ask you then, since you brought it up, are you currently for Medicare for all? or do you have a different idea of how to get reasonable, if not free, at point of service healthcare to Americans?
I want to see a healthcare system that is available to everybody uh, at either free or very low cost. Uh, it, it, you hear Medicare for all. It may come out that way. It may come out uh, several different ways. There's going to be an enormous amount of negotiation in that, and I'm not going to predict what's going to come out as the most acceptable to most people. People who have insurance right now like it, and they're going to fight like crazy to hang on to it. But I think the virus has demonstrated the fact that even people who thought they were secure were nowhere near as secure as they thought they were.
Mm.
And so I think the coming out of this, if there's something positive amidst all the other tragedy, all the other hardship, is going to be the fact that we're going to take a much closer look at our current system.
Mm-hmm.
The system was weak in many ways. We just didn't see it. 80% of people on minimum wage do not have sick leave of any kind. And so these are the people that are serving our food and working those kinds of jobs all around us. And they have to go to work when they're sick because they can't afford to not work, and they have no sick days. So, we I'm sure, have been spreading the virus partly because we don't give our employees sick leave. Everybody's going to get sick,
Mm-hmm.
but we don't want someone who is sick serving our food.
So let me ask about another issue that was raised in the Democratic campaign. A businessman named Andrew Yang had brought up the idea of a universal basic income, UBI, and I've always been for UBI. In looking at Yang's UBI, I think there's some issues with it, and I think there are better types of UBI. In general, though, it sounds to me like you would probably support something like a universal basic income. Am I correct?
I think that a UBI, and not necessarily the one he proposed, but something in that direction, comes with a lot of good ideas. One of the things that made the Great Depression worse was that when people lost their jobs and could not buy things, manufacturing shut down. And we are dangerously close to that point, even before this thing struck, where fewer and fewer people at the bottom could afford to buy the things that the people at the top needed to keep the economy going. And I think Yang understood that. We need to make sure that every segment of the economy has something to spend. And so from the point of view of the people at the top, it's helpful. We see it now in the payments that both Democrats and Republicans have supported since the virus started to try and help the people who have lost their jobs. Republicans have tended to put it in terms of helping the companies at the top, and the Democrats have put it more in the terms of trying to help the people in the middle or at the bottom. But really, it helps everybody, and it's an idea that I think as more and more jobs become automated, it gives us a better chance of making the transition into whatever our economy is going to look like as things do become more automated.
Let me speak a bit about racial and ethnic issues here in this country. Recently, there was a viral video that went on. Two white men, I think it was in Georgia, somewhere down south, one an ex-cop, shot this young man who's black, who is jogging along. And in the last 5, 10 years, with the rise of cell phones, we've seen an endless stream of black people being assaulted. My first interview with a presidential candidate a month or so ago was with Mark Charles, who I mentioned earlier, and you said you had debated. And black people and Native Americans have been traditionally the two most oppressed groups in this nation's history since its founding, and even before, actually. What would you as president do to address some of the issues? Are you, for example, in favor of perhaps reparations for the descendants of slaves? What would you do, for example, with the Native American reservation system? Would you want to improve it somehow?
Yeah, there's a little question. Where to start? Well, first of all, even since the case in Georgia, there's another one. I think it was in Kentucky or Tennessee, where a African American woman who was asleep in her bed, and the police burst through the door and shot her 8 times. So we have had an endless list of examples of the same thing, and we have had problems with race relations in this country. My early upbringing, both my dad and my mom had Nisei, Japanese classmates who were hauled off to camps, and they spoke about that often while I was growing up. And so that's kind of what I was raised on, the idea that that was wrong. And we have had horrible relations where we broke treaties with the Native American population, and over again we've done that. Trying to go back and correct every wrong in the last 500 years is incredibly difficult to do. I think what we have to do is make sure that starting today we're doing better. And it's something that's in human nature. I think it was Lyndon Johnson said, if you can take a poor white and give them somebody to look down on, you can pick his pocket while they aren't even looking. And so we need to create a society where other institutions are looking out both for the person that's being looked down on, whether it's African Americans or it's Native Americans or Asian Americans or whatever, intercede on their behalf to try and make things fairer. And at the same time, deal with the people who are looking down and controlling the system and picking people's pockets. And there's a couple of institutions that are capable of doing that. One is government and one is religion. And I think both of them are necessary. And both of them have tried. Both of them have failed in ways. But I think each of them needs to be strengthened and focused on working on that. As far as reparations, I think if we just, for example, in the African American community where schools and healthcare are so disproportionately targeted into upper class neighborhoods, white neighborhoods, if we can turn that around and improve the healthcare. When I ran for Congress, there was a district in Southwest Fresno that was part of the district I was running in, a zip code where average life expectancy was 68 years. And 12 miles up the road was another zip code where the life expectancy was 81 years. Well, guess where the hospitals were?
Yeah.
The hospitals were all in the healthy neighborhood, long life neighborhood. So I think the first step in correcting things is making sure that we're doing our best to bring things up to equity today. I think if we can accomplish that, trying to make up for what happened before is simply not gonna make it. Today, African American mother is 4 times as likely to die in childbirth as a white mother. Those are the things we have to fix.
How about, so I would assume then you're against quotas then?
I would have to look at that on a case by case.
Okay.
I think quotas have helped. I think quotas have sometimes been abused. That's a real fine line there, trying to be fair to everybody at that.
Okay, let me even move on, since you had mentioned about the hospitals. I wanted to bring up a subject since I had mentioned to you before we started the interview that I work in a supermarket. And there's a term called food desert, wherein sometimes in poor urban areas, and also when I spoke with Mark Charles out on Indian reservations, there are usually not Safeways or even Walmarts or Targets where you can get food at a reasonable price. And so the poorest people often pay the highest prices for foods. And this just further impoverishes them. And part of the reason I think so is the idea of American corporations, in that it's all about profit, profit, profit. If you were president, how would you deal with this odd phenomenon where the poorest people often pay the most for goods and services?
That is a serious problem. Even in the town where I was teaching most of my career, you could go into the convenience place at the gas station and buy chips or donuts or something, but there was no place in town you could buy a carrot. And it is going to be difficult. There's got to be a way to favor small town businesses, either with favorable tax write-offs, or local towns can set up like business districts with special things, and they need to be encouraged. At a federal level, that's going to primarily be with some kind of subsidies or tax policies. State governments have some other things they can do, but federal government needs to facilitate it primarily economically. Both, as you say, grocery stores, hospitals. Large parts of the country don't have healthcare near them. That can be, intentionally coming up with programs where, we will cover medical personnel's college if they agree to spend, 5 years in a rural area, or, those kinds of things, where we don't create two completely different countries. Our cities and coastal areas with wealth and good services, and the rural areas without them.
let me just move on this segment, and then we'll move on to something else. Uh, since you are well versed in history, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on corporate personhood. In the year 1819, the Supreme Court decided the case of Dartmouth College versus Woodward, which basically established that corporations were de facto human beings. I don't know if you know of that case or its implications. I've often thought that it's probably the most wide-ranging negative decision that the Supreme Court ever came up with, even more so than some of the infamous decisions regarding slavery, because we're still dealing with the fallout. Uh, First off, are you familiar with that?
Hmm.
Yeah. So what would you do? I would assume you're against corporate personhood from what you stated?
I am against corporate personhood. I think that's a horrible, horrible misconception. If you look in the history of that, one of the key people behind it was Roscoe Conkling, who was a senator from New York and probably one of the most corrupt people in a corrupt period post Civil War. And he was instrumental in negotiating that. Um, and we have things backwards. We say that corporations are persons with the rights of personhood, but the unborn baby is not a person and has no rights. And so we have that exactly backwards. And I would like to see that reversed.
So, just picking up on a point you just touched upon, let's talk. You and the ASP are pro-life, and there really are basically three major touchstones to those positions. One is abortion, the other is euthanasia, and the other is the death penalty. Let's deal with them one by one. Let's start with abortion, since you brought that up first. Um, what would you do to reverse the Roe versus Wade decision? And do you not think that there's a bit of misogyny in that?
Well, uh, as the first part of that, reversing it, I do believe that at some point the Supreme Court will reverse it. It was, uh, I think, an atrocious legal logic to start with, and it has been now supported over these years by a very strong, uh, organized push to protect it. But I think it fails under its own weight, and it will eventually be overturned. So the bigger question is what will happen afterwards, and among other things, the contest will go to the various states, and the states are already getting ready for that. I think everybody anticipates that it's going to be overturned, and so then the question is just what do we have afterwards? And so you have states like New York and Virginia and California that are rushing to put state laws in place so that nothing will change when Roe is overturned. And you have other states doing the opposite to be prepared for when Roe is overturned. But I think Roe will be overturned. As far as misogyny, um, I think a lot of people are having second thoughts about how abortion does or does not hurt women. The the young feminists, a lot of the young feminists are saying, you know, abortion has not helped us that much. They're saying uh, it allows men to use women, and that was a mistake. And so the pro-life movement has a large number of young women, some of them atheists, uh, coming from all kinds of feminist traditions, and they're saying abortion has really not helped us. it has been a mistake, and we need to get out from under that mistake. So I think that's an area where I'm listening to women, what women are saying, and I'm going to support them in that. And I think that, there's can't think of her last name, Destiny. She writes sometimes for the newspaper in Dallas, but she makes a good point that feminists who have tried to put equality by making women's bodies perform like men's bodies are hiding femininity. I mean, what women can do that men can't do is have babies, and abortion means that you are changing the female body to be more like a men's body, so it can't have babies. And she's a new wave feminist, and she's got a valid point. I have another Facebook friend that I've been following recently. She's Canadian, atheist, vegan, and she was trafficked as a teen, and had 5 abortions forced on her, either by those who were trafficking her, or at one point she was in a Catholic school and the nuns took her for the abortion. And she says, I didn't have a choice in any of that. The whole idea of choice oftentimes is a euphemism for a woman being forced into an abortion she doesn't want. This woman, this Canadian friend, is extremely hurt at the loss of the 5 children that she wishes she had. They were all conceived during the time that she was being trafficked and pimped. But she really misses those kids that were aborted and taken from her. So I'm leery of the idea that abortion actually gives women new rights. I don't think it's true.
Well, we've spoken. You have spoken of abortion in political terms. Let me just, since you have a broader background, let me just talk philosophically, because at some point there's going to come the medical knowledge that we could probably have children born in test tubes or outside the body, so that women won't even have to get pregnant, say in 50 or 100 years. So that then makes the idea of abortion less about quote unquote killing or not, but genetic sovereignty. Do I and a woman, or even gay couples now, might be able to genetically manipulate things so that they could have a child? Do you think that ultimately the question of abortion comes down to genetic sovereignty?
No. I think there is in the human person an instinct that is, well, here's one that's just come up. They've got a problem right now in England. A bunch of women who were contracted to do surrogacy. They have now delivered babies that were contracted by people in the United States or other countries. And because they can't travel, they cannot deliver the babies to the contractual owners of the baby. But they are terrified that if the baby stays with the surrogate mother, she's going to grow attached to it. So they've taken the babies away from the surrogate mother, and they're trying to find other people to care for the babies, because they don't want the surrogate mother to become emotionally attached to the baby. That's just nature. That's human nature. Parents become attached, and mothers especially, to the babies. And if we put babies in test tubes, we are losing out on an enormous amount of the natural bonding uh, that goes on between a mother and a child. That's something that's a good thing. We don't want to lose that. Uh, when you put a baby in a orphanage uh, during the early years and they're not getting the mother's care, they're warped for life. They never catch up. We don't want to take babies away from mothers. We don't want to put babies in test tubes. Uh, Motherhood and fatherhood, I'm a father, is, is one of the most rewarding experiences in life. And we don't want to remove children from parents or parents from children. Now, a lot of times things happen, um, and we want to adjust to situations where we don't have the ideal, but we should never lose track of what the ideal is.
Okay. Let me move on to the second sort of pillar of the pro-life. And one of the terms that I saw on your website that you and the party use is pro-life, whole life, for whole life.
Mm-hmm.
So let me talk about euthanasia, since that we're talking end of life. We started with the beginning
Mm-hmm.
of life. Let's move on to the opposite end, and then we'll get to the middle. Uh, in 2009, my mother, who at the time was 86 years old, fell, and she was living on her own in her apartment, and she basically decided that she had had enough. She didn't want to live as a cripple, and because we live in Texas, it's illegal to commit suicide, and so she decided though. Or to actively commit suicide, she decided that she was just not going to eat, and it took her 17 days, and she basically starved herself till she died. She was in hospice. She had hospice workers come the final few days, and she had some issues. One of my mother, who was an agnostic or an atheist, there was a woman, one of the nurses, who was trying to guilt trip her to start eating because it was against this woman's belief. We reported that lady, and we got a hospice nurse that gave some good care to my mother in her final days. But why? What do you think is wrong with someone like my mother, who at the time was blind? She had emphysema. She had a number of other problems, wanting to end her life on her terms.
Well, I also lost both of my parents within the last 10 years. And they were both uh, in hospice care. And, uh, and so I understand some of that. In both cases, some of the most precious moments I ever had with them came towards the end. And so, where your mother made a decision uh, and she stood by it, I can respect that. But there's a big difference between a person saying, I think I'll just stop eating, and doctors coming in and just administering things right and left. One of the things we've seen in Holland, uh, in Canada, is that places that start with uh, legalized mercy killing, very quickly the slippery slope works more in this area than any other area I can think of. Very quickly, doctors are making decisions to terminate people without permission from them. They're not even informing the person or the family. They just do it. Uh, every place that has started with euthanasia, legalized assisted suicide, has gone down that slope very quickly. Now they're not waiting for people to be in the last few moments of life or days of life. Uh, and I have no problem with doctors giving painkillers at the end. I have no problem with that. But now they are saying, well, this person, this 17-year-old girl was depressed. So we ended her life. She wanted to end her life, and because of depression. Well, once you start down that slope, there's always one more reason um, to decide that somebody else's life is not worthwhile, and so we'll take it away from them. And that everywhere that has approved euthanasia has gradually included larger and larger numbers of people in the acceptable list.
Well, let me just pick up on 2 points regarding that. On a similar tangent, since you talked about a 17-year-old being depressed, and I've seen a few cases where people have wanted to, some teenager broke up with their girlfriend or boyfriend, and I want to end it all. But on a similar, and this gets back to abortion too, in terms of the age of which one can consent to have an abortion. But we now have what's called transgender rights, and there are children at increasingly, and I would personally think absurdly, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds saying that they wanted to transition to the opposite sex. What do you see a similar kind of slippery slope argument with that? I know this. We'll get back to the euthanasia, but I just found it interesting when you talked about the 17-year-old wanting to commit suicide. What is a good legal age of consent for anything, whether it's the military, drinking, drugs? I would assume. Are you also open to people doing drugs of their choice then, and other things, sexual and whatnot? Is there an age of consent that you find to be across the board?
I think ages of consent are always going to be arbitrary. I spent my life mostly teaching junior high kids, and you see them in any group of junior high kids. You see some who are more mature than others, and the ones that are the least mature tend to be the ones who want to try something like that first. And so to try and come up with an arbitrary age is really difficult. But legally, I think you have to. You have to come up with an age. And I think that for different things, there need to be different ages. Obviously, military wants 19-year-olds if they can get 19-year-olds, and coming out of high school, that's probably an appropriate time. Lots of kids are trying to find themselves and go into the military because they don't have the money to go to college or something like that. So I think that's even though many kids don't understand what they're getting into, going into the military at 19, I think that's probably going to be the age that we have for that. If you're talking about marriage, I think we've also decided that 18, graduate from high school, and then you're ready to get married if that's your choice.
Yeah.
So that's an obvious one. We've made 18 for voting, and I agree with that one. You mentioned drugs, and studies are showing that the human brain is still developing up until about the age of 25. Marijuana can be inhibiting the normal growth and development of the human brain. So if we're going to say, all right, well, then do we make the legal age for marijuana 25? Those are all difficult things that have to be done carefully, looking at the scientific data. And so there's not going to be one uniform age of consent. Likewise, I have seen junior high kids, especially, struggling with sexual identity. And I remember one student, a girl, in the 7th grade. She was a horrible, horrible disciplinary problem. I mean, she was just acting out all over the place. And then in the 8th grade, she decided that she was lesbian, and she relaxed and became much more pleasant to be around. That was a situation where at that age, she came to understand herself better
Mm-hmm.
and was able to relax and cope with life. But with something like transgender, how can you settle on somebody making a life decision, either to undergo hormones or surgery, when they are so young that they have not had a chance to find themselves?
Yeah.
To make an irrevocable decision that young is wrong.
Let me pick up on the slippery slope argument and use it. I'm going to get to the death penalty in a moment, but with the COVID issue that, as we record this now in the year 2020, President Donald Trump and a lot of, especially Republican, but some Democrats too, have taken this attitude that there are acceptable losses and deaths in the COVID thing, but we got to get the economy moving again. And to me, that seems a very slippery slope argument in that, well, if it's acceptable to have 50 or 60,000 more people dead in our state, but the economy doesn't tank X amount, do you see some of that? Because one of the things, I myself am not quote unquote pro-life. I don't particularly like a lot of these labels like pro-life or pro-abortion or whatever. But at least looking at the ASP position and your position, you are consistent pro-life whole life. It seems to me that a lot of the people who quote claim to be pro-life are only pro-life for things like abortion, but they support the death penalty. Or in this issue of COVID, they seem to have this military kind of approach that there are, well, if we only lose 50,000, that's not bad. What has been your take in the last couple of months with President Trump's handling of this and the whole, what I find very dismissive attitude, because it seems to me that the people that are dying the most are the poor, the minorities, and the people that are just quote unquote workers, not the rich. What's your take on that?
Well, I think I agree with you. I think that President Trump, through all of his decisions, is looking to protect the business class. And when it becomes obvious that most of the people who are dying, or a disproportionate percentage of the people who are dying, are very poor, or have pre-existing conditions that may very well be partly due to the fact that healthcare in our country is not as good for the poor as it is for the wealthier. And we have, from a government standpoint, budget standpoint, one of the ways to, save, that's the word they would use, save Social Security, is to have fewer old people. And they may not want to come out and say that, but that's got to be in the back of their minds as they're looking at this. We can reduce the number of people on Social Security by letting a few of them die, and that's a horrible way to approach it. We want to save everybody that we possibly can, and we want to balance that with a reasonable reopening. What we've seen in past pandemics, the Spanish flu, for example, had 3 peaks. And when they let up, immediately it peaked, and they closed down again, and then they let up another time, and it immediately peaked a third time, and they had to close down again. What I don't like seeing is the fact that in the close down, a lot of small shopkeepers were told they had to close, but the big box stores are still open. So there needs to be more fairness in this. We could, I think, have a much more generous opening if people would agree to put on masks and do the hand washing and all the other things that are known to help. Mm-hmm. But we have so many people who are rebellious and, well, you can't tell me anything, I'm going to do whatever I want, that we can't open. If people would agree to take the necessary precautions, I think we could open more, and we could have our economy, if not completely back up, at least much closer to being back up.
Yeah.
And there needs to be fairness. When we're told that you can't, and these are more state orders in some of the states, you can go into Target, but you can't buy a child's car seat, or you can use a motorboat on the lake, but you can't use a canoe, or those kinds of things. Beaches where we're told that sunlight kills the virus, but people can't go on the beach even if they are maintaining the proper distances. There needs to be a better thought out delineation of what we can and can't do. And, much of that has been at the state level, different orders by different governors.
I don't know if you saw the video a week or two ago about where a lot of white males with guns sort of stormed the Michigan State Capitol. And one of the thoughts that ran through my head is, if those people had been black, or they had been Native Americans, or they had been someone other than a bunch of angry white males, it would have been like Kent State times 50. But anyway, I wanted to get to the death penalty issue here as the final point regarding pro-life stuff. I'd mentioned earlier those two racists that killed this black jogger on video. I think of someone like Ted Bundy, a serial killer. I can think of, organized criminal hitmen, and I can think of terrorists like Timothy McVeigh. Why would you support keeping basically scum like that alive then?
Well, it is very difficult to come up with a legal definition of scum. And we have to have a law that fits everybody. And if you go back to the very first murder, Genesis 4, Cain's murdering his brother Abel. And it's interesting that God did not punish Cain by killing him. He banished him. And Cain says, well, my punishment is too much. If I go out there, everybody's going to want to kill me. And God says, oh no, if anybody kills you, the punishment will be 7 times that on whoever kills you. And by the end of that chapter, we have a guy saying, if anybody kills me, he's telling his wife and kid and daughter, if anybody kills me, I want you to take out 77. And that tends to be the human approach to things. We want to get even, and it tends to expand. In other words, we have gang killings in our area. Kids get involved in the gangs, and somebody gets killed, and then they have to go to the other side, and they don't really want to get one this time. They want to get two or three, and it gets worse and worse. And I think the biblical command that God gave for the death penalty was actually to limit that. And I think banishment, when a person can be banished, and I think life in prison without possibility of parole is that kind of banishment, that protects society. And it reduces the need for somebody to feel like they have to take revenge into their own hands. That's the real danger when you have horrible crimes, is somebody wants to get even. And you get a cycle of violence that continues. But I think if you can guarantee life without possibility of parole, then nobody has to feel like they have to get even. And that's the ultimate goal. We want to protect society. We don't want to see cycles of revenge killings. That's the most important thing. Even with a Timothy McVeigh, if he's in prison, he's not going to be, well, two things. He's not going to be out where he can do anything. And when you execute him, sometimes they become martyrs to a cause. You don't want that to happen. And so I think an awful lot of times our capital punishment system, first of all, picks on minorities, picks on people who grew up in horrible circumstances. I did get a pen pal on San Quentin death row in the early part of this century, 15, 17 years ago. And I visited him twice, total of about 6 hours locked in the cell with him. And we never talked about his crime. He had killed a bunch of people. We never talked about his crime. We just talked about all kinds of stuff. He was charming company. What I know about his crime, I had to find on the web. And when you look at his childhood, there's a guy who was suffering post-traumatic stress syndrome, the inability to form bonds with other human beings. And there is, if you did the same thing to 100 kids, you would probably get 95 of them to be dangerous to society. But do you punish somebody who obviously cannot be loose in society, but do you punish somebody because they happen to have been subjected to that as kids? And so many of those people on death row have had horrendous childhoods. So I think we serve the purpose if we protect society by keeping them away, but we don't have to take vengeance on them. So often I think when we look at somebody and say, well, they're scum and they deserve to be killed, it's vengeance. And I look at the verse, Jesus said, vengeance is mine. It belongs to him. I don't want to take anything that belongs to him.
So you would disagree with those people who would say that the justice system is just a polite way of society to get its revenge? Then you would disagree with that notion?
Well, it is a way for society to get revenge, and to do it, hopefully, ideally, it would be in an organized way, but it hasn't turned out to be that. But I don't believe it's proper to do it that way. I don't think it's the way God intended.
So, Brian, we've talked about some of the things specific to your and the ASP's major ideas, opinions, platforms. I want to talk a bit more generally, though, about society and politics and life now in 2020 and going forth through the rest of the 21st century. So let me just start with, you are a member and the candidate of what is called a third party here in America. And there are many electoral problems. We've seen consistent fraud. When Bernie Sanders ran, there was obvious fraud and tampering with machines on the Democratic primary side. A lot of people looked to the 2016 election, and they saw Hillary Clinton had done some shenanigans on the Democratic side. The Republicans and Democrats are always playing games. Are you in support of something like ranked choice voting, meaning that if there were 10 candidates running, presumably you could rank them from 1 to 10, favorite to least favorite? And do you think that would help third parties both in major elections and also to get seats on local assemblies and local city councils, and et cetera?
I definitely support ranked choice voting. Not only would it help third parties, but I think it would encourage the two dominant parties to put forth less extreme candidates. Because if you are appealing more to the center, where right now we have primaries that direct us to go to the extremes. Let me use abortion and the Democratic Party, for example. The Democrats started with over 20 candidates, and every single one of them took a position, abortion for any reason, up to the day a woman goes into labor, she could still ask for an abortion. That position was only supported by less than 20% of the Democrats. Most Democrats say that there should be some limits. They may disagree on the limits. They may say, whether it's heartbeat or whether it's feeling pain or whatever it is, there needs to be a limit at some point. And a third of Democrats describe themselves as pro-life. And yet there was no candidate in that original group of 20 or so. There was no candidate that spoke to the 33% or so of the Democrats who feel they are pro-life. Every single one of them spoke to the small minority that think you should have abortion anytime for any reason. If you had ranked choice voting, you would be far more inclined, I think, to have a broader spectrum represented among the candidates. And even the ones that may have been at one point, for instance, I think at one point Tulsi was more pro-choice, but she got the message. If you're going to be a candidate, you have to go to the extreme position.
Well, since you mentioned Tulsi Gabbard, let's talk about foreign policy and military. If you were president, there's a term now called endless war, and I read somewhere and saw somewhere that in the now 244-year history of this nation, there's only been something like, debatably, arguably, considering whether something was a skirmish or war, something like just anywhere between 8 and 18 years where our nation has not been at war with someone. And I think you had mentioned earlier, either privately or during this conversation, about Eisenhower and the military-industrial complex.
Excuse me.
Okay. What would you do as president to change that? To disincent the use of military first and foremost, whether it's against our enemies or whether it's just the threat of it? Can you answer that?
Well,
It's a night.
it won't be easy. President can't just go in and declare that our military is out of business. But as situations arise, it's up to the president to say, first of all, it's a whole lot easier to get into a war than to get out of one.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we've learned that in Iraq, we learned it in Afghanistan, we should have learned it in Vietnam. So the first thing is the decision made at the point of potential entry. And wars that we are already in, you know, I think Obama went in saying, you know, get out of Afghanistan, and he got the Nobel Peace Prize for saying he was going to do it. And 8 years later, we were still there. So it's not an easy cut and dried thing. But at every point, at every decision making, you have to come in with the idea of saying, we want to be less involved militarily. We want to be more involved in diplomatic efforts. We want to be less controlled by our appetite for oil. We want to be less controlled by the companies that are making profits off of war materials. It's not a one time you get up in the morning and you're done. Mm-hmm. It's at every decision point coming in with the idea that we want to be more involved in better relationships with other countries. Our foreign policy is so much involved in maintaining favorable access to certain minerals. And we just need to bring a new approach to that and say, that's not going to be our priority anymore.
Let me go on a tangent. Infrastructure is a terrible problem here. My dad was born in 1916. During the Great Depression, he served in something called the Civilian Conservation Corps. And in the 1970s, when I was a teenager, I was volunteering at the senior center where my mother worked, and there was a wonderful program called the CETA program. I forget what it stood for, CETA, and Ronald Reagan, when he became president, killed that, and a whole generation of kids who were learning valuable work skills were just cut adrift. If you were president, would something like CETA, or even more so the Civilian Conservation Corps, would you consider something like that to get young people, especially young men, but now young women, to go do projects that are positive rather than just, because a lot of times poor kids, the only option they have for money is to join the military. But to have a civilian equivalent of that, that's helping with global warming, that's building bridges, that's cleaning up neighborhoods, et cetera, and so forth. What is your take on public service in the U.S.?
Absolutely. We need to have that kind of thing. When we look at our unemployment statistics and we say, well, look, we have such, the lowest unemployment rates in ages, what that doesn't count is the fact that a lot of people are not even trying to get in. They've given up.
Yeah.
And a lot of them even are in prison. If somebody is in prison, we don't count them in the unemployment, but their energy is not being tapped to the benefit of our economy. They are not gaining. Society is losing. And so anything that we can do to reverse that, to look at the forgotten people and say, these people do count. They are part of our economy. They're just not being given the chance. Okay, I have a friend, a young fellow. I have known him since he was about 10. And he's been trying to get a start in life, and he's 30, and he's still struggling. He would make a really good barber, and he would love to be a barber. But to get a barber's license, first he's got to come up with, $5,000 to go to barber school. And that kind of thing keeps him out of our economy. If he could apprentice to another barber, or do something like that, where he didn't have to come up with such an enormous lump sum to get training.
Yeah.
But the gatekeepers of our society have said, well, we want to have barber colleges, and so we have to force everybody through a barber college before they can become a barber. It's protecting the interests of the people who already are in.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to do multiple things to make it easier to break into our economy.
Yeah. As we're speaking now in May of 2020, the unemployment rate because of the COVID has gone up to nearly 15%, the highest rate since the Great Depression. But just to pick up on your point, our so-called good economy before this hit was paper thin. I mean, President George W. Bush, a dozen or so years ago, changed the way that the unemployed are counted, and that after 12 months or so, you simply go into the twilight zone. You don't count.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, I do want to pick up on the global economy, the green economy, and global warming. And one of the things that I have, there's this idea of the Green New Deal. One of the things that I have thought is that people think there's got to be just a silver bullet. But depending on where people are located, in what country, it's going to take dozens of different ways for areas. Some people can use wind turbines. Some it's going to have to be the tides and the water coming in and out if you're in a coastal area. I think the Green New Deal, battling global warming, is the biggest existential crisis right now in terms of the next 50 to 100 years. As president, what would you do to put the U.S. at the forefront? Because the U.S. has basically just dragged its heels while the rest of the world is taking it seriously. So could you address that?
You are right. It's not going to be solved by one thing. It will take lots and lots and lots of different things put together.
And we have to realize some are going to fail too.
Some are going to fail. You're in Texas. You're not near the Panhandle, are you?
No, I'm in the Austin area, dead center of the state.
I drove through the Panhandle in end of October, and was amazed at all the wind turbines, windmills.
Yeah.
And where we have something like that, we have to take advantage of things that are local to the geography of a specific place. When we go with solar, the enormous problem is that the sun goes down at night. And so at night, in areas that are dependent on solar, you have to fire up the coal furnaces to take you through the night. And we're finding that that's so inefficient to fire it up and turn it down, and fire it up and turn it down, that you lose a lot of the benefit of the solar. Uh, so we need to investigate every possible way. We need to reduce our dependence on carbon. I'm against fracking. We will probably have to find ways to put thorium nuclear reactors online. Right now, the problem is that all of our nuclear regulations are designed for the previous generation of technology.
Yeah.
And so one of the easiest things we can do is very quickly rewrite the regulations on our nuclear to be appropriate to the new technology so that we can get some of those online fairly quickly. I think there is really no way that we're going to solve our problem without at least a healthy dose of nuclear. But it needs to be the latest generation of nuclear, not the plants that we have sitting there idle 30 years later because they're too dangerous to take apart.
Yeah.
And there are technologies for taking carbon out of the air. Some of them are just as rudimentary as planting lots of trees. And several countries have done that. And we should be able to do that and benefit at several levels from putting more and more carbon into the vegetation.
Yeah.
But we need to do it really fast.
Yeah.
And if there is another silver lining in this pandemic, maybe it's the idea that we realize we are not immune to some of the kinds of disasters that previous centuries saw. And the reality that, yeah, things can get really bad real quick, and we need to be doing everything we can ahead of time to prevent that.
Yeah, it's not only, I think people have a one-dimensional view. They think it's just the ice is going to melt. That's going to affect people at the shore, but far worse is the acidification of the oceans and the dying of the coral reefs, the ring of garbage in the Pacific. That's something that a civilian conservation corps could get a handle on. Let me turn to a couple of other political acts that happened around the time you were born that are having some massive effects, and then we'll sort of wrap up, and I'll let you talk about some things that maybe you wanted to talk about that I didn't touch on. Two very key decisions or two political acts that have had lasting repercussions. I want to talk about the Glass-Steagall Act in 1933, which was the act that initially separated what were called savings and loans from commercial banking, and then I think it was around the turn of this century that was basically scrapped. Are you in favor of going back to Glass-Steagall, or separating it? Because what we've seen, I think, is we've seen banks getting into things that they have no idea about, whether there's insurance and whatnot, and I think that's wreaked a lot of havoc. What's your take on that?
I agree that we need, if not Glass-Steagall, something very similar to it. And when banks were given the freedom to kind of do whatever they want, and I think actually that happened under Clinton, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, I believe so.
They went hog wild. And we wound up with the collapse of 2008 because of it. And then we said, well, the banks are too big to fail, so we're going to bail them out. And the bailout went to the people at the top.
Yeah.
And they gave bonuses to their top executives, the guys who had gotten us into the problem, where there were no programs to help the people who were losing their houses. if there had been programs that could help the people who were losing their houses to catch up on their mortgages, it would have saved the banks. But instead, we helped the people at the top. The people at the bottom lost their houses. The banks wound up with houses that they could not sell or even rent. So we have all these, it was done backwards. And when, right now, when we're doing the bailout, we've seen that an unfortunate amount of it went to the corporations that could handle a little bit more stress, and the people at the bottom were not helped. People who were small business owners and were submitting requests discovered that the money had already been grabbed by the people at the top who could afford to hire the accountants to do the paperwork to apply for it. The small guy with running a pool supply or something doesn't have the time to fill out the applications until the money's all gone. And so we need to control those big banks. They're still too big to fail, and we have to make sure that we don't have banks that are too big to fail, that they have to be more limited in what they're able to get into.
In 1947, there was another act called the Labor Management Relations Act, known as Taft-Hartley, which basically set up what's now called the right-to-work states. Just to give you an example, about 5 years ago, I was fired from a company after I had reported some things where they were breaking some local health and safety regulations, and I had no recourse legally. I contacted a labor lawyer that said if I had been in a non-right-to-work state, I could have probably won enough money to retire, but because I was in a right-to-work state, tough luck. What is your take on Taft-Hartley? If you were president, would you seek to amend that, to change that? You have stated that you're pro-union, so I would assume that you are against the whole right-to-work thing.
There needs to be a reworking of our union labor relations. There are valid complaints against some unions. I have a friend who, whenever I mention unions, he brings up a time when it was the union that abused him. It wasn't the corporation, it was the union that abused him. And so there needs to be, within the unions, protections of that kind of thing. You don't want to have a Jimmy Hoffa or some other union leadership that's tied in with the gangs and things like that. That's a valid complaint. But once we have done some things to protect the unions from that kind of corruption, then we need to give every American, at least in appropriate businesses, the right to join a union. When you have, Amazon right now, as people are trying to form a union, Amazon is firing those people as fast as they can weed them out. And so there have to be protections for people who would like to have a union. And I'm a member, or was a member while I was working, of the teachers union. And in California, you cannot become a teacher without joining the union. And my biggest complaint against the union was that so much of their political action was going to help candidates who supported abortion. And so my union was supporting the very people I was trying to get out of office over that issue. But abortion should not have been an education issue. The union should be there for the teachers. And if unions can do a better job of staying in their area of their proper area of um, influence, then they should be given the green light to do whatever they can uh, on behalf of their people. And if unions did a better job of that, I think there would be less pressure for right to work laws. So both sides need to do some adjusting there. But I am a supporter of unions.
Brian, let me just start wrapping things up here. I want to give you a few minutes to talk about anything that I may have missed. But before I do that, for people who want to know, I will link below this video to both your website and the ASP website. Your website is briancarroll.life, and the ASP's website is solidarity. Is that a dash party.org? Bad eyesight, but it'll be linked below for people who want to check out the party or your website. So let me just ask a question. As we are talking in 2020, maybe in 100 years, there'll have been several third-party presidents, but you have probably I've probably got as much chance of riding on Halley's Comet as you do actually being elected president. So people would ask naturally, why are you running then? Is it to raise issues? Is it to hopefully open some doors for future candidates to get in at the bottom ground level and build the party? What is the reason you are running?
Well, I think all of those are part of the reason. With a third party, there are several ways you can win. One is if the major parties see you taking votes away and they adjust their policies in your direction, then you've won. I think Ross Perot accomplished that when he ran. He didn't get a single thing voted in the Electoral College, I don't think.
No.
But his issue was balanced budget. And both the Republicans and the Democrats, for the next decade or more, spent a lot more attention thinking about the balanced budget. So Perot, in that sense, he won. Mm-hmm. Ralph Nader, when he ran, again, was looking at a bunch of different things. Some of it was ecological, and some of it was product safety, and all the things that he's known for. And he didn't win the election, but he definitely raised consciousness on that. If the Republicans look at a sizable percentage of their pro-life vote slipping away because of people who don't like to see kids in cages at the border, people who want to see something done on the climate, if the Republicans see their pro-life votes going to an alternative party, then they will maybe come back and take a little bit more interest in trying to meet those needs. If the Democrats see a bunch of their people who have traditionally been voting Democratic say, we've had it with this, we're going to go vote pro-life, then they will have to spend more time thinking about that. It hasn't been that long when you could be pro-life and be a Democrat. Dan Lipinski, who just was defeated in the primary, I think he and his dad between them probably, I don't remember, 50 years in Congress between them. And when he came in, there were lots of pro-life Democrats in Congress. And one at a time, they've been ousted, primaried. Even in 2018, Bernie Sanders supported a pro-life candidate for mayor of, I think it was Omaha. Well, you can't have that now. Now, if you are pro-life and a Democrat, you're just simply told you can't run. And so if Democrats start to get the idea that they're losing a large segment of their voters who are pro-life, they will have to rethink that. And I certainly hope they do. So those are both ways that you can affect the course of policy decisions in the country. We do hope to build the party. We figure that nationally in 2016, a lot of states don't count write-in votes, but we probably had maybe in the vicinity of 15, 17,000 votes if you count the votes that didn't get counted. We figure that we can do 10 or 20 times better than that this year and make ourselves bump us up into the next echelon of candidates or parties. You know, right now, when you look at third parties, immediately you're thinking libertarians and Greens, maybe peace and freedom. We think we belong at least in that echelon. Mm-hmm. And we think we can achieve that. And when we achieve that, then we can start having people say, yeah, I'm going to run for Congress as Solidarity Party. I'm going to run for mayor, Solidarity Party. I'm going to, you know, right now we don't have that visibility. And so we hope that we can do that. And then the other thing is, I think both major parties are coming apart at the seams. And it could be that in a major reshuffle, we would get enough people to make ourselves one of the leading parties.
So let me just ask then, as we wrap up here, I've tried to give a balance between your party's views and views, things that weren't enumerated necessarily in your platform. Is there anything that I've missed? Are there one or two things that you would like to bring up and talk about, both your personal and the party's positions that I may have neglected?
I think you've hit on the major things. We are pro-life for the whole life. That means we want to see health care and the other kinds of things so that a woman in an unplanned pregnancy doesn't have to resort to an abortion. I think most abortions happen out of fear. And if we can do the things that reduce the level of fear, we are going to reduce the need for abortions. And so those all go together. Along with, we've talked about the capital punishment, we've talked about euthanasia. All of that is a pro-life thing, but so is the environment. Mm-hmm. You know, we are looking at ecological disaster and massive numbers of people either dying from the various warming problems or migrating. You know, when we talk about peace and trying to maintain fewer wars, if you have mass migrations, and our military is predicting that global warming will bring massive migrations of people, far beyond what we're seeing at our border now, and it's going to be sparking wars everywhere. So for a more peaceful world, we have to do what we can to prevent that kind of disaster from happening. So all of these things are interrelated, and that's where our party is.
Well, Brian, Carroll.life is your presidential website, and solidarity-party.org is the American Solidarity Party's website. I want to thank you for spending a couple of hours talking with me. It was very informative, and I wish you luck in the campaign and also further on in life as well. So, Brian Carroll, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Dan. This has been a great time. I've enjoyed it all.